So we've looked at a basic example of creating a view and pulling data from it into EntityFramework, but I had a good question from a student about this challenge, and that was they wanted to pull all roles from the identity system, whether there were any users in it or not, but the ones with users, they wanted to include to know what users were in each role. Right. But as soon as you see something like this, the SQL developer in you should remember, hey, to get all the roles, whether or not there's a related user, that requires an outer join, right? Yes, you can do outer joins with LINQ, right? But you get into things like this group join approach and default if empty and so on. And it can be kind of messy code, especially this is only two tables here. But imagine, our many to many relationship where you've got to go across multiple relationships between multiple tables, right? Get pretty ugly looking. So, one of the ways we could approach this is to put a view in the database itself, returning exactly what we want. Because, hey, we've done SQL. We know that outer joins and so on are pretty easy to write in our simple select queries in SQL. Okay, but just before we even get into that, I do want to just share that there is the possibility, to handle this in a slightly different way. Uh, Remember what we did in our user roles controller, right? Back then, we created this view model, a user view model. It had the ID of the username, and a collection of all the roles. And we had code like this in the index of that user roles controller that goes out, hits the database by pulling in all the users, right? Building our view model objects, but all we're getting is the ID and the name. To go back and get all the roles, because it wasn't built in, the roles collection is now gone from identity. It used to be there, but now it's gone. Is what I did is I did it for each loop, going through each user and taking advantage of the get roles async method of the user manager to populate this with all the roles of the user. All right, we'll talk about the the cons of this approach in a minute, but it worked and it got our job done. So that user's collection of our view model objects had all the data we needed at the time to show every user and what roles that user was in, right? Well, this is kind of the opposite though. We want to show all the roles, whether there's users or not, and then the users that are in it. Now, if you took the code that we had earlier and just added a bit more, right? Just this query here, just to go and get the actual roles. So we don't miss any, whether there's users or not, makes no role here. Sorry. No roll. Bad pun. Anyway, so we get all the roles, and this, of course, is another hit to the database. But now we have everything in memory here on the client, so we can just do a simple link like this, where I'm just using an anonymous type at this point. I don't even need a view model really, so I'm just grabbing the role name and the collection of users. Okay, this relates it because if that user roles collection contains the role that we're considering, then we add that user to it, right? So all the users would be there. So that would give the answer the student was asking for. But let's go back and talk about the problems. The reason why people would possibly object to this approach in general is the number of times we're going back and hitting the database. Some people get very much on their, should I say, high horse or podium and talk about, oh, you should never do that. If you can get it all in one trip to the database, that's always better. Well, I just want to get on my own little podium here for a second and talk about this issue of efficiency and performance. Okay. You've heard me say something like this before: get your code to work first, right? Get your program working. That deadline's coming up. You got to have something to show your client or end user. And if you spend too much time tweaking about efficiency and performance tuning and so on, you can miss those deadlines. So get it working reliably, and then you go back and you can usually fine tune performance later, right? And this business of hitting the database multiple times, it is not the biggest sin in the world, right? Actually, I've done quite a few experiments where, you do one massive big query with all these joins and then, break it up into smaller steps, pulling subsets of data in with literally simple queries with hardly a join involved, and then just do a bit of work in the actual client, and you often can get every bit as good a performance, sometimes even better, because those massive queries that our link will generate sometimes with all those joins can be very inefficient. right? So it's not always. It depends on, of course, how many records and so on. Like if you think about this example, the more users you have, this for each loop, for each one, you're going back out to the database with this command here, right? So if you have more and more users, then the efficiency of this goes down considerably, and it makes it more worthwhile switching to a different approach. But anyway, I just want to say that it's not the end of the world, right? However, for this example, we're going to return all the data we want in a single trip to the database. And we're going to do that by having a view, right? That way we can easily write our left joins and so on and so forth. Now, as I note here, one of the complications is that I want to write a view pulling data from all these tables. Well, those tables exist right now in a separate database from my production tables. So do I create the view inside the database with the identity tables by going through the application DB context? Well, that involves making changes in the actual identity system. We said at the beginning we want to avoid that, right? That's not something we want to mess with. I don't want to get involved there. So there's an easy fix, okay? Put it all in one database, right? There's no reason earlier why I had it separated other than that I was lazy, okay? There's no reason you can't have it together. Yes, in the real world, you might decide to keep your identity tables separate if you're going to use the same login system for multiple applications, right? In each with its own production tables in its own database. But that's that's only a theory. I've never actually even had to do it in the real world. So yeah, it's a theory, but the truth is, quite often it makes more sense to have the identity tables, all our user tables and roles and so on, in the same database. And this is exactly what we're going to do. So that's a simple, quick fix. So in Startup CS, now I've actually done a lot of this just to save some time, so you're not watching me do things so slowly over and over again that you've seen before. So in Startup, all I did is I came down here and I copied the medical office context, that name of that connection string, put it in here to application DB context, right? So now both databases, yeah, they're separate contexts because they have their own sets of rules about how things happen in them, but they both are storing all their tables in the one. And in fact, that even allowed me to come into my app settings here, and I only need one connection string anymore because both contexts are using the same connection string, right? So that got around that problem. So now they're all together. Okay. So the next thing to think about was how are we going to handle this data? Well, I do definitely want a view model in this case. Whenever you're working with a view, you want a view model. So if I come up here to view models, this is the one I added, role with user. Okay, view model, right? No singular here. Okay, so I just have two things, the name of a role and the name of a user, right? Throwing a display name on there just for display. Okay, notice there's no primary key on this, right? And you might say, well, wait a second, don't we want a collection of usernames here for the role? Well, yes and no, but think about how a table looks in SQL, right? A database table always has rows and columns, okay? The results sent back from most of our views that are like summaries of data almost always are denormalized, right? You'll see things repeated over and over. In other words, think about it. If you've got 5 users all in the same role, right, then typically in a database view, you're going to see that role name repeated, okay, 5 times, one above the other, with beside it the name of each individual user in the role. So that's what we're getting ready to receive is data in that denormalized arrangement here. There's really no need for a primary key. In fact, it wouldn't even be appropriate because there's no one identifier for this combination of data, right? So to go along with that, though, we come to our medical office context. And so I've done the things similar to what we did a minute ago. I've added my DB set. Notice the pluralization here. Instead of role with user, I have roles with users with S's on the end there, right? And down here, of course, we add the model builder to define that this uh, entity, our role with user, view model entity, relates to a view in the database with the name roles with users. So this has to be the name of the actual view itself. Now I'm using the same name here for the DB set because that just makes sense to me. But the other key thing here is note has no key, right? Whereas in our last one, we had a ID as a primary key, right? We have no key on this particular one, which is appropriate in this case. Okay, and when we pause, All right, so the next thing we need is to create the actual view in the database. So I've done the same thing we did a minute ago. I've come into my extra migration steps and I have a create view command here. So here's the simple view, just simply selecting the name from the role as role name and username. Those, of course, I want to match the property names inside of my view model for later conversion into it, right? And of course, here's our join. So notice I've got 3 tables, right? ASP.NET roles, user roles, ASP.NET users, and all the joins using outer joins, well, left joins in this case, between them, right? Nice and easy to write in SQL, isn't it? Okay, so there we go. So that's all in place. So uh, the other thing I did, just to mention, just so it shows up more, is I added a couple more role names here. So when I run, it will actually create these additional roles. I'm not assigning anybody into them, but that just so I can prove that it is returning all roles. And just so I had at least one role with multiple people, I just put here my admin user in both the admin and supervisor roles. So now I've got two people in the supervisor role, right? Both admin one and supervisor one. Okay, so that's a little change I made as well. All right. So basically that's it. So I just delete, recreate the migration. I already did it. And in the migration, I added in, oops, sorry, right down here. I could have shrunk it down. It would have saved time. But anyway, come on. I can get there. Way down here. I was going to save you all this time, but not. Okay, just added my extra migration steps, okay, into the migration after I rebuilt it here. Okay, so now we're ready to actually use this, right? So I'm going to just close all this up. We're done with that. So let me come to, now I could put this anywhere that we have access to our uh, medical office context, right? Now the other day for a different demo, I added into my controllers here, the home controller, I added code so I would actually be injecting the medical office context for a different demo. But it means it's a nice, clean, simple controller that I can work in. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to add a little bit of code. Okay, another action result. Notice I'm not even bothering with asynchronous here. Not that it's a bother, but just for quick demo purposes, right? I'm going to call it roles, okay? So here my link query is simply my context roles with users, that DbSet, just adding as no tracking, because why? We aren't going to edit it or update it or anything, and to list, right? So I can return that to the view, and that will give that whole collection, right? Okay, so I just need a role to go along with this. If I go add view, just an empty view, because without a primary key, the scaffolding system has a bit of a hard time actually, oh, okay, I'll call it roles to match the name of the action. And it will just come with some garbagey stuff, so I'll just get rid of that. Okay, now what I could do, since I didn't have the scaffolding, is I could just come to any other index view of a nice simple things like conditions, steal the code out of here and bring it over, and that would give me a template to follow, right? So that's basically what I did here. And in fact, I used that very one. But let me just come in and get my code in place. Right, so this is the typical thing we might create. Notice I took out the create and don't have any links for edit or details because none of that plays a role here. There I go saying role again, right? But my model is an IEnumerable collection of my view model role with user view model, right? So here's my typical layout. I just loop through and show all the data. So I think we're ready to actually give this a try, run the project and see what it looks like. Okay, so I'm up and running. So if I didn't add a link here, but this will get me most of the way, and I can just change privacy to roles, right? And here's my list of roles. But you see that look, right? Typical database query result, okay? We have this denormalization, if I've got 10 people in the supervisor role, I'd see supervisor 10 times over, right? So if you really don't like that look, and I can understand why you would feel that way, it's really not a problem. What we're going to do, I should have done Control F5, but I didn't. What I'm going to do is I'm going to replace just the table portion here, right? The usual layout. And what we can use, we do know we have GroupBy that's available in our link queries, right? So this is a little bit of a different arrangement for the table. I'm using some extra Bootstrap classes to make it look a little bit more professional or fancy looking. But basically, I've got the role and the users. Hey, I could have probably used display names and so on, but that's okay. This is just done in a hurry here. But you notice as I go through, I can take the model and I can do group by role name, right? And that gives me the key, of course, is the role name. And I can show that there. And then when I come to the body of this table within a table, I just go through and show all the usernames. So that's it. So let's just see this effect now. Get this up and running. Let's put in my, oh, oh, well, that's what I get for copying and pasting. Okay. All right. Once more, because I copied and pasted something else. There we go. All right. So there's a look that maybe is a bit nicer. So here's each role. Okay. Admin, supervisor, and so on. Here are all the users. So you see under supervisor, I've got 2 different users. These roles show up. They aren't left out because of all the left joins, even though there are no users associated with it. So there we go. So it's another use of having a view actually in the database, pulling the data in, and we can even get around the limitations of how databases think about data if we're a little bit clever and do some group by, even just right in the view itself.